Welcome to the Professor Carol podcast. Join Professor Carol as she brings you cultural history like you've never experienced before. Visit ProfessorCarol.com and take advantage of any or all of the courses available to members in the Circle of Scholars. That's ProfessorCarol.com. Our Western culture is not an elective, it's a treasure.
Well, hello. Welcome to everybody. It's lovely to be together on what is certainly almost wherever you are, bound to be a cold, cold day. We're amazed by what we're reading about the weather. I don't think it would bother Beethoven too much because he came from a much colder climate, but we certainly are having an exciting time of it. So I hope you're in a warm spot now. The Missing Piece is a series we're starting to look at some of the great figures in Western culture that are household names, basically. Certainly, I think it's fair to say that of the composers, there's several that anybody kind of has heard of, and Beethoven's got to be almost number one. You could argue whether it's Mozart but you know, Beethoven, there you go. It's a name people recognize, and it's an image people recognize. So we're going to try to look at some of the things that are famous about these famous people, but maybe not quite what we think they are. That's sort of the premise of the missing piece. We want to fill in that missing piece. If we think about this business about, let's see, I'm trying to get my little slides to move now. Left and right. Left and right. One of the things I thought we could talk about is this idea of the image of Beethoven. It's funny, we do all these different kinds of webinars, and sometimes it's up and down, and sometimes it's left and right, so I think we're good now. Beethoven also would have very little sympathy with this problem, I think. But this is how I think most people would recognize Beethoven. Does that seem familiar image to you, Paul? I don't know.
It is. And did he really look like that?
Well, we'll never know for sure, right? What strikes you about, I could ask everybody out there, what really strikes you about that image when you see it? Is there anything right up front?
For me, of course, there's obvious reasons, but what strikes me always is the hair.
The hair. Yeah,
it's big, and it's, and it's usually kind of puffy, and it's wavy, and it's got that look to it. Michael Landon.
Okay. Well, that's an image our younger viewers wouldn't quite know, but I agree with you on that, and everybody has a version of that. What else strikes you, I think, about that? And maybe some of the viewers, I'm going to have to rely on Paul to translate this to me for right now, but what else sort of knocks us in the face? It makes us know this is Beethoven. This has got to be Beethoven. Is this a well-kempt Beethoven? Is this a Beethoven who's carefully dressed to appear before the Count and petition the possibility of a commission that will allow Beethoven to pay the next 3 months' rent? Do you see that in there? Or do you see a guy bursting in the door saying, "I am the genius, and I am writing this music, and this is the power I am bringing"? Does that seem a little more like it in that image, or is that reading too much into it?
No, that one right there, I'm going with that. It looks like he's got that artist look to him, and the intensity in his face.
Okay, I'm so glad you said that. If anybody else out there is saying that artist look. Now, see, when I said that artist look, almost everybody in our culture, modern culture, will know what that is. We can get 50 different variations on it. So here's one of the missing pieces. Where did we get the idea of the artist look? I can tell you one thing. If he had shown up at court in his, say, middle of his career with his collar like that, and that look of it's almost a look of defiance, a look of power, and this would have been a problem. Let's look at some more images of Beethoven. Okay, let's see what happens when we go to this. Now this is Beethoven, but what about the guy on the left? And of course you're going to guess that it's Beethoven. What does that strike you? How does that strike anybody?
Well, for me, it is not. Actually, they're not looking like the same guy. In some respects. But that would just be, the hair.
With the hair, he's a little better put together, and of course it's earlier, but not by much. And of course these are portraits, and one of the great things about earlier periods is we don't really know. If we're lucky, we have multiple images. There's an awful lot of famous people we have only one or two portraits, and so one of the missing links always with historical figures, whether it's Thomas Jefferson, whether it's Goethe, whether it's Napoleon, whether it's anybody, Charlemagne, is that in many cases we don't even have any images of some of these people. So we get our image based on other things. Let's look at some more images. What about that? Would you think that was Beethoven walking down the street at age 31?
I would not.
Yeah. and certainly much more presentable for what he might need to do. Look, again, the key is always the neckwear. I mean, I hope the ladies are laughing, but look at our modern era and men's neckwear. Of course, men still put on suits and still go to, need to dress up. But overall, if you just grabbed up 75 people out somewhere, what would you see in terms of neckwear these days? Neckwear tells a lot of cultural history in the Western culture. In men's neckwear, okay? I mean, ladies' collars can tell a history too, but the men's neckwear is critical in understanding a lot of phases of cultural history. Let's look at some more images. Again, we're lucky to have this many. Beethoven was born in 1770. Here he is 33. And again, tying those things was no easy trick. And of course, we see something quite different in this. And we don't have time in just a hangout to think about who painted, under what circumstances, for whom. Not everybody got a portrait painted. Think that too. It's not like snapping a picture on your cell phone. Okay? Here he is.
Now, it's elaborate, and it's like all the way up to the chin. I mean, every bit of neck is covered in both of the last two pictures.
Yes. Look at this too. You don't want to wear that to work, huh?
No. I would think that if I saw somebody like that right now, I would think that they were in a little fender bender recently.
Right. I think when you were an artist in Beethoven's era, you were constantly feeling as if you were, because you see, we have to remember one of the things about Beethoven, and this is part of this image. The image we have of Beethoven has developed through the very end of his life and since then. Beethoven would be shocked to know how he has fared in popularity and how we perceive him today. His concerns were survival. He is existing as an artist at a time where people are losing the comfort of being well employed and solidly employed, hopefully, as court composers, theater composers, cathedral composers. That was the story of life in Mozart's period. And this will be true for all artists. It's not that suddenly the money had completely dried up, but there is a new era of patronage in the 19th century. And you have to please in a different way. And it won't be many more years after Beethoven that you have to figure out how to organize your own concerts, get your own tickets printed, hire your own musicians, print your own programs to be able to have a concert. All of that would have been foreign to a composer in Haydn's day or Bach's day. Those, there were some concerns, logistical. But this image, so I want to make sure we get to the three missing pieces I want to talk about today. Let's go through a few more of these things. Now we're picking up an older Beethoven, a little more hair. Again, that very, very formal cravat. And again, we'd have to ask a question about each painting, why, by whom. And now, again, you're seeing it, a little bit of a change. This artistic image, of course, he's older. He's better known. His works have been in many ways more successful. He's in a very puzzling period, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And now we're hitting a 19th century bust, past his lifetime, you see, where we now, this is our Beethoven, right? This is Beethoven. We know that we've decided he was based on his music and the impact it had on the next generation, the next generation, the next generation, all the way down to us today. You ready for the wildest one, Paul?
Okay, sure.
There it is. Max Klinger's monumental, mythological, Grecian godlike, if you will, statue, which is in Leipzig, which was done for a very important exhibit that involved what they call the Vienna secessionists, and this incredibly, many of you know the work of Gustav Klimt, for example. We don't have time to go into all that, although I'd love to do it. And we do that in our courses, by the way. We get into these issues. We look at the painters. We look at the poets. We look at the politics, everything we can think about that would have involved this. But you see, now we have an Olympian deity, practically. Beethoven, if he'd walked by this, would have, and saw his name on it, what do you think he would have done? I can't even imagine what he would have done. He might have said...
I don't know if he would recognize it as himself, that's for sure.
And he might have wondered how he got up there and where was his shirt, Now, there is a wonderful book, and we're going to be putting a website on our ProfessorCarroll.com for the Missing Link series, and I will post there something to a book by Alessandro Comini, who is a professor emeritus at SMU, at Southern Methodist University, one of the great art historians, lovers of music and music history of our time, who's been very influential in Viennese art and also in music and art over many, many decades. I mean, she's just I can't even begin to tell you, but she did this book called The Changing Image of Beethoven, a study in myth making. And she literally takes the times, the places, the portraits, the physical descriptions people left in letters, and she looks at how, as Beethoven's music went from being a symphony, a great symphony, to a force of creativity. How did the image grow and grow till you finally get to something like this at the dawn of the 20th century?
We do have a couple questions.
Please, let's hear them.
Yeah, well, Catherine asks, in so many of the pictures, even though his hair changed, it looks like he never combs it. She says, why is that?
Well, he did have a reputation of being somewhat unkempt, especially later in life. We've got to remember that Beethoven never married. He had many, and again, there's a lot of wonderful things you can read about this, and if people are really interested, I can post some of this. He had many changes of address, let's just put it that way. He was slow to pay his rent. Sometimes he didn't have the money. Sometimes he simply forgot. People who came to visit him were kind of distraught at the condition of everything, and we don't have to go into the details there, okay? And there wasn't a Mrs. Beethoven saying, Ludwig, you haven't done your cravat correctly. Was he, or is he indeed, when we look back on him, his personal habits, his isolation, his intensity, which many artists have, but was he, in a nutshell, the person that launched for us this image of the artist, certainly through music, and gave permission to, even to today, for artists to be a little crazy, a little extravagant, a little inexplicable, a little pink hair and green hair and purple hair? Is he one of those missing pieces that open an image after his life for artists to have a different set of rules, in a way, to function in society?
Well, Amanda, she asks something that I believe you're going to touch on in missing piece number 3, but she talks about a very determined look in his eyes in the photos.
Okay, can we hold on to that, because she's exactly right. And of course, when did painters, would they have painted an artist in 1720 or in 1750 with that same look? So much of what we get from the image depends on what was the popular style of painting. We look back, we see old paintings, right? But these were cutting-edge portraits, almost like fashion shows. I mean, not in Beethoven's sense, but think about it. Everybody wants to see the new style, and artists were constantly painting in the new, or many of them, in the newest style. So painting these people with that look was very trendy in the 19th century. It might, you wouldn't have done it in a Renaissance portrait, right? But suddenly when you get to 1800, 1790, 1820s, 30s, 40s, we have that whole Byronic, from Lord Byron, the poet, we have, and from Pushkin, and from the late works of, at least the way people look back at Goethe and Schiller. We've got this idea of this unleashed genius that can have that look in his eyes, and in fact needs to have that look in his eyes, whether he ever did or not.
Well, what do you have next for us?
Let's go. Let's see what we have. Oops, I just went back to the beginning somehow. That just was in there. Let's talk about the missing piece, I think, that people associate, and I think it's fair to say most people, if they know the name Beethoven, they've probably heard that he was deaf, right? Does that seem fair?
Yeah, I believe everybody wants to know about that, yes.
Well, and there are many very detailed articles, again, I can list some on the website, that talk about what they believe was his real medical condition. Not a lot was known, and there were certainly no cures. The best people had to offer were those metal ear trumpets. I'm sure you've seen them. They look like something somebody worked out in high school shop. The ear trumpets, which are horribly awkward, and of course said to the whole room, I'm deaf, I can't hear you. And going for the cure, going to the baths. I won't take the time now to talk about that, but this is the hot springs. We think about it as going to the spas. You would take the mineral baths. They're all over Europe. They're in what we would call today's Germany and today's Czech Republic, and throughout that whole part of Europe, you've got these mineral baths and mineral springs, and they were the answer to everything from rheumatism to emotional problems, to, allergies, what we might say today, to, you name it. Everybody took the cure and hoped that these mineral baths would fix it. And that was one of the things that Beethoven did often to try to help his deafness. I think you can guess it didn't help. Okay? So what is it that people think, and people, again, let me know what people are writing, if they are, but why do people think the deafness is so interesting, Paul? Why do you think it's interesting?
Well, because he's dealing in a medium which needs audible, and you need to hear.
Okay.
You're going to make something, you're going to want to hear what you've made.
Okay, and that's what I was kind of hoping you might say. How about that? That's what we think. You have to hear to compose, and I think people. Okay, do you have to hear to make up or to hear a song inside your mind? And this is the missing piece too. Number two, that the way most composers work, not all, but most, it happens in their inner ear. We might say inside your head, in a modern way of saying, in your mind. And to prove that to yourself, how easy is it for everybody out there just to listen inside your head and hear 25 songs, one song. Hear maybe your mother's voice singing a lullaby to you, if you will, or say to hear think of the I Want to Hold Your Hand, or Peter, Paul and Mary, or the voice of anything that you might have grown up with. How about a tune that your child's been singing, the Itsy Bitsy Spider? Can we all do the Itsy Bitsy Spider inside of our head easily, right?
Easily.
Yeah, it's almost, have you ever had a tune, I call them earworms, that are stuck in your head, you can't even get it out? My point being that that's where most composers work on their music. Now they verify, and some composers are more tactile. Stravinsky liked to be at the piano and really feel it physically through his hand, even though he's writing for orchestra. So there are things like the piano hearing instrument helps, but the actual mental and artistic process happens inside, and it's not dependent on the human ear. That's a fact. It's on paper. It's part of it's intellectual. Part of it is knowing the rules of harmony, knowing, especially in that period. It is not dependent on what goes through the eardrum.
Now, did it cause him problems, though?
Well, that's it. It did cause two specific kinds of problems.
Okay.
And these are the most important. I mean, you could add to this, of course. And I want to, if we have time, I'll say a word about Beethoven's sketches, because that's one of the, you talk about a missing piece we have for most great artists. We don't know their creative process. We don't know, okay, when they woke up and at 10 o'clock on such a day or in the morning, they started this idea, and then that evening X'd it out and went to this idea. And then this whole thing went on the floor, and then something else, and then 3 months later. Well, we know a lot of that with Beethoven. We know because of the sketchbooks, and I'll just dangle that right now. But let me tell you about the two problems that it definitely caused. And I think this is where we need to focus when we tell our children about, well, Beethoven was deaf. The first one is that and you said it earlier, Paul, he couldn't hear to confirm in his later life. And it starts about 1801, 1802. I mean, he's only in his 30s, early 30s, and it gets worse. And by 1818, he's stone deaf, okay, as they say. He couldn't, when he put something in front of an orchestra, he couldn't confirm that the balance between the oboes and the horns was good, or that there were too many or not enough of the viola, or he couldn't confirm the live performance, and he couldn't confirm all of the balance in the orchestration. Does that make sense? So he lost the art of confirmation of what he had put on paper, and this is definitely a professional handicap. Okay.
Now what about? Was the amount of work that he did before and after, did it ramp up or did it slow down?
Well, he was what we call prolific. I love that word. That's a good one. If you're looking for vocabulary, everybody, for your kids, prolific is a very helpful word. Out came a lot of creative works, and most of them were fairly amazing, hundreds. And his ability to compose kind of depended on how he was feeling about things and where he was and how focused, as it is with most of us. There were years that were fallow, and there were years like in the mid-period where he's writing the violin concerto, the Fourth and Fifth Symphony, some of the most important piano sonatas, the Opus 59 string quartets. I could go, it's just going boom, 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 boom. And that was after he had just had a tremendous disappointment when a cure that he hoped would happen at a place called Heiligen City, Heiligenstadt, and he had gone, and he really was hopeful that it was going to help, and it didn't help. And he was in this terrible state, and yet, bing, out it came. So then he has fallow years in the 18 teens, and then he's back creative in the late years, writing things like the Ninth Symphony and those late piano sonatas and string quartets that people are still in awe of. So it's up and down, but the deafness sometimes put him in a bad mood or a good mood, but family things, his brothers, his interaction with a guardianship, that's a real mess. I mean, you want to read a wild story. But here's the thing. So it kind of wasn't an issue of deafness. It might have been a response to how he was feeling, but not, I'm more deaf, therefore I can't write, because his late years are his most extraordinary. He couldn't hear a thing.
Okay.
But I want to tell you the second thing that's really important for us to keep in mind about his deafness. It made him socially, but first of all, awkward and timid. I mean, I don't have a whole lot of time to read some of this, although it is so fun to read what Beethoven wrote, because he wrote so much cool stuff. I love my Beethoven books. I hope everybody has a good Beethoven book. But he writes, for example, here, and I think this is about 1801. Yes, he's writing. He says he's nervous. He doesn't want anyone to find out. He said, if I had any other profession, I might be able to cope with my infirmity. But in my profession, it is a terrible handicap. And listen to what he says next. If my enemies, of whom I have a fair number, and he means competitors, in that respect as well, were to hear about it, what would they say? You see, and how do you appear before Count and please him with who you are and get commissions? How do you appear before the Duke? How do you go out into society? How do you join? And being social in Vienna was terribly important. We are not in 1920. We're in 5 and 10, and when he came to Vienna after 1792, he had to become socially successful. And that's hard to do if you don't have a good family. He didn't have a lot of money. He didn't have the best clothes. He didn't comb his hair enough, like you said. And suddenly he's not able to sit at a dinner party and chat, which he hated all that stuff, by the way. But most artists don't like it, but they do it. He couldn't interact socially, and he couldn't hide the deafness at a certain point from what he would say in this letter, my enemies, people who were not his supporters. He could be mocked for it. He could be, seen as incompetent for it. So it was that kind of a professional handicap.
Well, Catherine states that she believes that his music is so interesting because it did originate out of his deafness, some of it, and out of his head.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah.
It frees you up. If what you're responding to now is no longer what you heard at some party or some concert 2 weeks ago, or what somebody has said to you they expect, you suddenly have a world where you're 100% able to respond to what you hear inside. And for an artist like Beethoven, or many artists, then that means you are up and running. And
Right.
It's an open playing field. It's sort of like playing football and there's no defenders, You just run it down the field, and that's what he did in his late works. He
Possibly
wrote
more focused.
Pardon? Yeah, well, so many things he hoped might happen in his life didn't. And when you get in those late years and you have that kind of creativity, what you're going to do is pour it all out on the page, because you want performances, you need to pay the rent, you need to be able to hire musicians, you need income. But so many things you might have envisioned are no longer going to happen, so he just went for it.
You mentioned a good Beethoven book. What would your recommendation be?
Well, if you want to study his image, then I would go for The Changing Image of Beethoven by Alessandra, Alessandra Comini, Comini. It's available in a new edition, if I'm not mistaken, and you find used copies as well. She's just extraordinary because she's going to look at the art, she's going to look at the fashion. It's not a music book. It's a book about how culture since Beethoven's death in 1827, and even before it, looked at those images such as we were just looking at, and really why they developed to the point where you get that Max Klinger in 1902, and Beethoven has become like Zeus. She takes him from this guy who wanders into Vienna in 1792 and not really ready in some respects for what he has to do in the big city, coming from Bonn, which was smaller, and she takes him from that point, and then she really, it's marvelous. You'll just love that book. So should we get to point 3, or should we take some more questions?
Let's go on to point 3. I'll bring up the questions as I find them.
Okay.
On here. But we do want to know about that intensity of emotion and his music and how it played out in the music.
And I think that's one of the most interesting points, and I believe someone earlier was asking about it. And of course we can't do this without listening. Ideally we sit, we listen. How much emotion is too much? What is the role of emotion in music? All of these things. We think it's terribly important in our day to be very emotional and to have things touch us and move us and stormy. And there's actually a movement in the 18th century called Sturm und Drang, storm and stress. It was a literary movement where the emotions and rocking those emotions became more important than other literary aspects of a work. And Beethoven sort of brought up in that. That was kind of his, you might say, his teens and 20s, and reading some of that literature. we think this is the height of musical creativity. But if you back up into other eras of time in the arts, it wouldn't have been the height. It would be one aspect. Lost in Beethoven's time, left behind because music was changing, the arts were changing, were things like balance and symmetry and restraint and categorizing the information. This was Mozart's world. This was, to a certain degree, back up further, Vivaldi and Bach's world, absolutely. The Baroque, where we have something called the doctrine of the affections, go all the way back to what Plato said about music. You know, talking about how music had to be handled very carefully because it was very powerful, and you shouldn't mix up those emotions. A soldier shouldn't listen to this music in this kind of a key the night before a battle because he will lose his will to be strong and brave. You know, throughout our Western cultural history, there's been a strong understanding of the role of emotion in music, but it's never been thought to be a good idea to unleash it totally and let it run rampant. That's a 19th century idea, and I think we know it led to a lot of crazy things. So, you know, Beethoven, when we look back at it and we look at his turmoil, and because we have his sketchbooks, because we see the creative process, many other things, something called the conversation books, which are fascinating. One side of the conversations with him from about 1818 on with many, many people, so we know what they said to him. We can trace the most mundane, did the potatoes get here, from the potato man, to the most intense conversations that he would have had, where they would write what they said to him and he would speak his answers. We have so much knowledge of Beethoven's inner soul, his inner workings, his creative process, that we can look back and we listen to the music and we sprinkle all that in. And we think, yes, what was driving him always was emotion. But you know what? And there's not time to go into this without listening to a lot of music. We'll do this at other points in our classes. But he was also driven by form, by considerations of harmonic progression, by considerations of what we call counterpoint and texture. He was thinking on many, many tracks. Emotion was one of them. Not necessarily the most important, even though we look back and see it differently. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, so order helps it, you know, keep it together. You can't have the emotion without some form of order to put it together. Would that be fair?
Right. Well, right, and the forms and reason Beethoven's music seemed to have opened up the whole 19th century is he took very well-established classical forms. If you have a child taking piano lesson, they're playing a little da-da-da-da-bum-ba-da-da-da, little sonatinas and things. Those are classical forms. They're forms, just like baking forms are. They have shapes. Things happen in the first section musically and harmonically and melodically. Things happen in the next section. Things happen in the third section. Expand that to make it 10 minutes long, 20 minutes long, 30 minutes long. Beethoven knew all of that, and he's always working in forms. The next generation is going to blow a lot of that up, but Beethoven is still writing quartets, sonatas, symphonies, themes and variations. He's working in fixed forms that Mozart would have known, that composers for centuries, well, I'm sorry, decades, I should say, decades would have known, and centuries actually, and he is sticking with those forms, but he is kind of making little explosions in the midst of them and stretching them and making them become something that is, because inside he is doing all that. The next generation and the ones after him will look back and say, look what he did, and now we can go with it.
That was what I was going to ask. Do you yourself, when you are going about listening to music, so to speak, can you tell Beethoven's impact?
You mean after his death, or after
yes.
his?
Yes, today. I mean, can you tell me? I know this is just off the cuff, and you know, I haven't given you any warning to research this or anything.
No. But, we shouldn't need to do that on a Hangout, right?
But, you know, what are there examples where you can see, okay, they were definitely influenced by Beethoven, and just going forward from Beethoven, his legacy?
Well, the next generation will really create some much more open forms that are based more on emotion and what we call text painting, storytelling through music. We call it the tone poem. Composers like Berlioz. And by the way, anybody who's taking Discovering Music with us, you're getting now into Unit 12. You'll be getting into some of that, and after Unit 12 as well, also Unit 17. In case you're doing, you know, we've got to keep our students going on the right spots here. But something that is the direct ancestor of what we would call the film score today. where suddenly it's not going to be sonata number 26, opus da, 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 or quartet number 3, or it's going to be a tone poem, Also sprach Zarathustra, that's a little bit later, or Harold in Italy, or Symphonie Fantastique, which in many ways still is quite structured, but still, or Hamlet, or Tasso, poems that Liszt wrote, tone poems. These were stories in music that used a lot of the classical principles, but didn't require the music to go in the same orders with the same rules and the same expectation. Instead, the story was driving what was written down. And that is the absolute direct ancestor of what in the next century will become the movie music.
Wow.
So that's one thing.
You got me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, of course, and also the idea that Beethoven worked in modas. Da 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 dum, da da dum, bum ba da 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 da, which is more like a melody. Bum 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 ba da 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 dum, bum bum bum. If you're talking about the Eroica third or last movement, I mean, we can go through the Beethoven, the middle Beethoven, the late Beethoven, and we're hearing these fragments of melodies, they're almost like patterns. They're not long flowing melodies. They're patterns, and they're punchy, and they can be added to, they can be chopped up, they can be intensified, they can be made faster, they can be made bigger. And and if you go back to really what ultimately would be Wagner, and then leading again to the open music of the 20th century and the film music, think of your movie music. It has these little motives, they're called, that convey emotion. And a lot of that traces to Beethoven, and he wasn't the only one, but he's our guy, okay? That was a lot to say in one sentence, wasn't it? But, you know, it's exciting stuff. He, again, would be floored, I think, to see the influence he had.
Wow. Well,
you have some questions?
Let's see. Just comments. Heather says fascinating. She finds it fascinating, and I have to agree. And you know, that's what I like about you, Professor Carroll, is that I'm a guy who, well, I took the bare minimals as far as music, but when you tie it into the history, and you, like you did today, and you tied it into film scores, I love movies.
Yeah, I know you do. I know that about you.
Yeah, well, all of a sudden,
we all do.
I'm a Beethoven fan, or I am a classical music fan where I didn't really know that I was previously. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You know, and so I appreciate that about you, about your courses, and
oh, look there.
Yeah.
Can you take a look at that in case people are not familiar with what we do?
Absolutely.
That's the one I was referring to before. If you are taking Discovering Music either in the physical form or the online form, Unit 12 is when we get into the creations of the tone poem Franz Liszt, the generation after Beethoven, working in what is called the shadow of Beethoven. Isn't that a nice term? The shadow of Beethoven. It's a shadow because people aren't exactly sure they were sure what to do. And we are just now, in this very week, opening Early Sacred Music, and I'm so excited about that. We've been working on that for 2.5 years. We had some great blessings that allowed us to film in Jerusalem, and that sort of started everything off. We had the idea, and once that came about, that opportunity, we just said, let's do it. And now, 2.5 years later, it's starting. And our first live class will be on 3rd of February. I believe, I'm trying to remember the time. I won't tell you it wrong, but it's on our website under that course. And we will have the study materials up in just a day or so. There'll be videos, there'll be video instruction, there'll be assignments, there'll be things to read to get us all ready for that first class. We'll go all the way back to the first temple of Jerusalem, and we will go through medieval period in this course. It's a 12-week course, and as I say, it's just about to start. And we also have our second semester of America's Artistic Legacy, where we're starting right around the years before the First World War. We'll be starting about 1880. Basically, and going on up in our second semester. The first semester is available for those who maybe didn't get in on it. You can go back and start the first semester. You can jump right in the second semester with us and then pick the first semester up later, because it's all exciting and it's not dependent on having done the first semester. Our Imperial Russia course is there at any point anybody wants to have it. It's a wonderful course. It's a very, very, very colorful course. Oh, I like it very much. And we have seminars and sessions on research and writing, and of course our big signature course, Discovering Music, and a program that you know well, Paul, Exploring America's Musical Heritage. And we're adding more things all the time. So that's the basic things about being in the circle of scholars.
Very good. Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. Do we have, I'm trying to get back to a little, I guess I didn't have
Yeah.
a closing slide. We should have had Beethoven's picture in there instead of the nice Russian Tsar. And were there any more comments that we wanted to share? Anybody?
Well,
I had,
Teeny, she says emotion was a big part of that era, and Beethoven used emotion a lot with his music. It's very
good.
inspirational to people of our time. She just made that comment.
Well, it is. And, you know, when we think back about it, think about the first time you ever heard it. How did it affect you? Can you even remember? What was it? Was it live or on a recording? I mean, it's hard. Sometimes I think it seems like we've known Beethoven since we were kids, you know, and yet it's not children's music, and we're not exposed to it usually as little children. Some people are. Um, I would say if you're asking how do I work with Beethoven, I would find one piece and let it become extremely familiar. And that
Mm.
might be one of the symphonies. People always pick the fifth, but it might be something like the fourth or the sixth or the first symphony is, you know, a little, maybe if you're not as familiar with it. Sometimes when we're familiar, it's too hackneyed. You know, we hear da 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 da, and we just go, oh, that's Beethoven. But we hear it, and then it's great stuff. Why is that Beethoven? You know, or you might. I love the concertos. The five piano concerti that he finished, and the violin concerto. Oh my gosh! If somebody wants a piece just to become what I call the kitchen piece, the thing you have on your CD player, your tape player. Some people still use tape players. I do sometimes. If you've never heard Beethoven's violin concerto, oh, it is so inspiring, and there's a melody. Ba da 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 dum, da 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 dum bum. And you know, he wasn't always the great melodist like Mozart or Brahms or George Gershwin. You know, he wasn't really a melodist, but when he gets a good one. And the thing that's so beautiful about that piece is the orchestra's playing it, and at the very end of that movement, finally the violin soars with it. It is so beautiful. It's Opus 61. He only wrote one violin concerto. So if you're trying to sort of do something fresh and new, but it's still Beethoven, it's good, solid Beethoven, and I just cannot recommend highly enough falling in love with the Beethoven Violin Concerto. I think it's going to be a beautiful thing for your heart and your soul.
Okay. Well, I do have a question. We do have a couple comments. Catherine, Amanda as well, both of them saying thank you and thank you for sharing your insight. And
My pleasure. Thank you for coming and joining us.
yes, thank you, everyone. I did want a question here. Being a guy like myself who just basically watches movies and gets his music from the movies, but how do I trust the recording of, if I'm going to look up Beethoven's Fourth Symphony, how do I trust the recording? I need someone who's going to portray it in a realistic way.
You know that there's so much available now. To me, and again, I'm not a kind of when I was a student, I bought what was affordable. You know, if there was a used one or something that was on sale, that's what I got because I couldn't do the fancy ones, even though my colleagues, some of them did. There are people who are connoisseurs, and they get on, especially on the internet. You could debate till 2 in the morning with people about the best recording of this or that. But I tell you what I think matters. There's not that many bad ones that you're going to find. That's maybe a silly thing to say. I'm sure you can find some bad ones. But it is possible now to listen. You can go to iTunes and listen to parts of many different ones without having chosen to buy anything yet. And you can see which one kind of catches you in sound. You may fall in love with a certain performer like Joshua Bell, and you want to hear everything he recorded. That's a nice way to go about it. You love Renee Fleming. You want to hear anything she sang because it's just great. Or Dmitri Forostovsky. You just want to look at him. He's so great, you know. And so I think you can find an angle. Don't feel intimidated by, oh, it's got to be the most important recording. You can do a little reading and find out that someone like Karajan, one of the great conductors, German conductors, was a specialist in certain types of music. So maybe it's good to listen to some of that. But I think the pieces speak through whatever recording. You're going to fall in love with those melodies. You're going to love those harmonies, that tension, that excitement. And then once you know the piece, you're in a better position, Paul, I think, to make decisions about what recording you like.
Well, what about you making decisions on a favorite? Are there so many out there that you don't have a favorite, or can you say that one thing is your favorite Beethoven piece?
Oh, you mean that single piece?
Yes.
You know what? I love that violin concerto. I'm sorry. Even though I didn't learn it till very late in life, well, not quite very late in life, as a grad student, late in my graduate work. I didn't even know. I was a pianist. I played all the Beethoven piano, not all, but many of the piano sonatas. I assumed they were and the concertos. I love the concertos. I think the Beethoven Fourth Piano Concerto, Fifth Piano Concerto, all of them, even the first. Piano sonatas are more austere. They're a little more intellectual. I don't mean that as an off-putting thing, but it is one instrument, one sound, it's almost like reading a very intense, cerebral book sometimes, And whereas a concerto is a dialogue, it's a drama. Piano, orchestra, go, 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 And so I think the concertos are great ways to get the kids in it. And you can watch this stuff on YouTube now. You can see incredible performances of some of the greatest artists by clicking the button. Ooh, I wish I could have done that as a student. So, but if you just want to do something and you want something gorgeous, I think you might love that violin concerto. I really think you might.
Wow.
I'm going to stick with that today. That's my recommendation. That's my menu of the day, okay?
Good. Very good. Well, thank you again, Professor Carol. This has been a great time. You have inspired me, and I'm sure those of us who've been watching have been inspired to go listen to some of those pieces right now.
Well, good. Well, come join us. We're going to have another missing piece pretty soon here, and we're going to keep working through some of these greats and try to figure out what the thing is that makes us think they're great, and is that even a true thing or not, or what we can explore further in putting that whole substance of these great, truly great artists together.
Thank you for joining us for the Professor Carol podcast. Remember to visit ProfessorCarol.com. Along with classes, you'll find live webinars, on-location video updates, and more.